Here's my pick of the games from round 4 of the Tata Steel Masters. Liren, world champion, white, against Ramesh Babu Praggnanandhaa playing black. Pragg is just 18 years old, and of course he'll be playing in the Candidates Tournament in April. Let's see what happens. So Ding playing white. King's pawn opening. Gioco piano, not today. It's a Spanish. And if we go on, knight f6. Now instead of the standard castles, Ding plays d3. So this move is favoured often by Carlsen. We know that he likes this straightforward pawn chain. Bishop c5 played. Castles, and now this is a threat now that f2 is protected. So that's why b5 comes. Bishop b3, d6. Now with the e-pawn protected, then the knight on c6 wants to come to a5 to exchange off that beautiful bishop. So that's why c3 is played. And you might remember we've seen quite a few games where bishop g5 was played with this very awkward pin. It's a very provocative move. So we've seen black often is provoked into playing h6 and g5. If you haven't seen some of those wonderful games that Carlsen played in the autumn, then do check them out. You'll find them on the channel. Maybe I'll put the links in. But Pragg was very prudent and played h6, preventing that pin. And Rook e1 from Ding, played very quickly. So he's perhaps preparing to push in the middle. Perhaps he's just leaving the f1 square available for the knight. Castles from Pragg. Knight d2, all absolutely standard practice in the Spanish. We see this knight just flip round here and either coming to e3 or g3. Bishop b6, knight f1, there we go. The knight's on its standard journey. Knight e7. Now I like this move a lot because it covers the f5 square, and we know that very often in the Spanish, if one of these knights can get to f5, particularly with a pawn on h6, then a knight on f5 is really strong. a4 played by Ding. Well, it's a good idea when the pawn is on b5 in the Spanish because you can perhaps use the a file. So rook b8 played. Obviously there was a threat to take here. h3. Okay, careful move. Knight g6. Yeah, this knight flipping round to g6. Very nice. And certainly white's knight is never going to get to h4. So yeah, I do like this maneuver a lot. Knight g3. The knights are matching each other on these squares. And c5. Pragg, sets in train his queenside counterplay. These pawns look pretty nice, and it's going to be really hard for white to break successfully in the middle. There's a lot of pressure there. Carlsen actually played this against Keimer. He took here and played d4 and queen c7. Well, it was a very, very complicated game. I think Carlsen won because he was Carlsen, not necessarily because of the position. It seems to me that black has a very, very solid position here. Ding played bishop e3, however. Okay, so it's solid development. And Pragg thought for a little while here, over 10 minutes, and came up with an excellent move. He played c4. And this is a little bit unpleasant for white to meet. And it suggests to me that bishop e3 wasn't the best move. So what's the big deal with this one? Well, the point is that the pawn on b2 is actually vulnerable. I mean, it occurs to me perhaps it would have been an idea to exchange on b5 first. I don't know. Or maybe do what Carlsen did, exchange on b5 and play d4. But this is pleasant. So, okay, what's the idea? Well, first of all, bishops are exchanged here. And if white captures on c4, then rook takes b2. And certainly black has achieved something there, because you can see that this is potentially a weak pawn. It doesn't take too much effort for black to target the pawn on c3. And this one somehow isn't weak in the same way. That can be defended very easily. So it's nice that this pawn is split off from the pack, basically. Certainly, white has to work to equalise that position. It's not the end of the world, but black can be pretty happy there. Therefore, Ding played bishop a2 and queen c7, just protecting that pawn and bringing the queen to a good square. Exchange on b5, and I think Ding would probably very much like to play d4 here, but that's a really embarrassing move for white. So it attacks the bishop. The bishop can't retreat because the rook is on, and then it doesn't take too much to triple on the a file, and that bishop is actually lost. So it's very awkward indeed. So Ding played bishop b1. Okay, now he might be able to play d4. So Pragg exchanged. But positionally, black is doing quite well here. Certainly there's a very simple plan. Okay, let's see what that plan is. First of all, knight f4. Good move. Why not? Let's throw that knight in on the outpost on f4, hassling the bishop. And if the bishop drops back, I mean, that's really the move that white ought to be playing, then this move b4, a simple minority attack, this one pawn attacking these two pawns, hoping to split them, and black is a little bit better here. It's certainly a little bit unpleasant for white. This position is so familiar to any Sicilian player. If you play the Kalashnikov, the Sveshnikov, the Najdorf, and you're used to playing positions with a backward d-pawn, I mean, this could have come from a Sicilian. I'll show you a couple of examples at the end of the game. So the idea, yeah, I mean, basically once this happens, you can see that the pawn on b2 is isolated. Even sometimes you can hit the pawn on e4, but basically the pawn on b2 is isolated, and that's a problem. And if c4, it also doesn't solve all the problems. For example, in this position, the knight can spin round to attack e4, attack b3. Pleasant position for black. As I said, I think bishop f1 is really the move you'd like to play. You'd like to keep that bishop. But instead, Ding thought, okay, I would just want to get rid of that knight. Let's simplify the position. And he played knight e2. And Pragg exchanged off knight for bishop, and I think that's very nice for black. Because this is now a very good piece on c8 and doesn't have an opponent. Bishop e6, really nice control over these squares. Beautiful place. Again, very familiar position to Sicilian players who play with this structure, that this bishop often sits very well on e6. It's such a chunky square. It's protected. It covers these squares, covers squares here. Very nice position. And this is going to be the plan again. b4, a simple minority attack to split these pawns. And this is already simply better for black. And it's going to be hard for white to defend this, because if you leave the pawn here, then this one will be isolated. That can be targeted very easily, and there could well be play on the b file as well. So what do? Do you leave it or do you take it? Well, Ding decided just to exchange off and to target this pawn on d6. So he played rook d1. So if Pragg, wants to simplify, of course you can simplify here, but of course not. You want to keep the tension. So Black holds this pawn and later on can go for the pawn on b2. In fact, it doesn't take too much rearranging to do that. Queen a3 defends the pawn. Rook b8, there we go, more pressure on b2. Defended with rook d2, that pawn on b2. But here's the point. Knight e8. Really simple. So that knight simply protects the pawn on d6. And then Black has a free hand to target the weak pawn on b2. Now at the moment we've got double rooks. We could also triple. And I mean, this isn't the only thing that's going on in the position. Imagine if a rook came down to b3 and swept across the other side of the board, looking at that knight. I mean, you can see there are tactics in the air already. Knight h2. So Ding was feeling the heat, because that knight was vulnerable to attack. Along with this one and rook b3. Well, rook b3 came anyway, pushing the queen back, and queen b6, another tactic. Pawn on b2 is attacked, but also the knight on g3 because of the pin here. So Black simply wins the pawn on b2. Okay, knight back to f1 protects this. Rook takes. Okay. Nice strategy, very smooth strategy from Praggnanandhaa, and mission accomplished. He's won a pawn, and now we get the technical phase. He's a pawn up, but with all the pawns on one side of the board, how easy is this to win? Well, I think the point is he can try forever, and this is difficult. You never know when you're defending, you never know which pieces are best to exchange, which pawns are best to exchange. These technical decisions, sometimes they take, many moves to play out, and only, way down the line do you think, oh yeah, might not have been best to make that decision. It's really difficult. And Black can play forever. g6, you've just got to play very carefully. You've just got to keep everything nice and solid. Okay, g6 makes room for the king, takes away the f5 square. Rook a1, little bit of activity. Nope, let's just squash that one. Bishop a2. h4 played. Yeah, well, it's reasonable. I mean, one question is, here's an example of where White can perhaps choose to simplify in a particular way. So how is knight d1? And after rook b1, White could play this. Now, was it a good idea to exchange off that bishop? It's really hard to say. This is obviously still very unpleasant to try to defend this for White. But technically, yeah, it's really hard to know whether that was a good idea for White to go in for that or not. In any case, h4 was played. I think it would be nice for White to advance that one, to sort of slightly damage the structure. So h5 looks very natural. f3, I think at some point this is going to have to be defended. And Pragg makes a very committal move now. It's not just difficult for the defender to know which pieces to exchange. But Pragg decided to plunge in and exchange the rooks. Now, when there's a beautiful rook on the 7th like this, you might think, well, could be a good idea to retain that rook. But very interesting decision. The exchanges. In some ways it just makes life a lot simpler. just to get down to the pure minor piece endgame. So knight e2, bishop a2, king f2, king f8. What black is trying to achieve here is this break. That's the one you want to go for. If you go for the d5 break, then it's all a bit regular. After the exchange, then it's not exactly clear what black has achieved there. You know, all the pawns still on one side of the board. Whereas if you go for f5 and exchange here, then you've got a beautiful central pawn mass, and then we have a passed d pawn, and in combination with the e pawn could be really dangerous. Now, obviously at the moment f5 is impossible, but for example, if this square were protected maybe by bishop, perhaps knight, perhaps king on e6, and you go for f5, then it could be worth doing. And white will have to decide what to do about that. If it's left, then perhaps this e-pawn can be weakened and then attacked. So, you know, that's one option. It could be attacked by knight or bishop if it's an isolated pawn. But I think that's really what black is trying to achieve here. Very difficult position to defend. Ding went for knight c3. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, I wonder if it might have been better to play g4. But very hard to know. So what's the idea? Well, if this could be taken and this one attacked and white has access to f5, that could be good. So what happens on pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn? Yes, this one is isolated. I can understand why Ding might have been wary about going in for this. But actually, you know, white can hang on to that one. And not absolutely clear how black makes progress here. Of course, you can try for it for ages. But that's an alternative way for white to defend. But instead, knight c3 played. Attacking the bishop, which moved, knight d5. And again, a big decision. Ding decided to put the knight in the middle and offering an exchange, and Pragg took it. But this turned out to be an excellent decision because f5 came very quickly, and yeah, just to repeat, this is certainly an improved structure for black because this knight will be forced out of the way, and then the d pawn is a really dangerous passed pawn. Beautiful centre pawns. Yeah, we've seen that so often in the Sicilian. The centre pawns come good. So how should white defend this? Well, Ding looked to simplify with f4, which at first glance didn't look like a bad idea, but, well, we'll see what happened. Waiting, again, with hindsight, looks like the best idea. Because in this kind of position, not absolutely clear how black is going to make progress there. You can play for d5. Put the king on e6 and go for d5. That's one possibility. But certainly f4, I think we can say, made life a little bit easier for Pragg. King f7. The king just steps up the board. There's no need to rush this. Yes, if, let's say, pawn takes pawn, then king here, and that's not so clear. But there's really no need for black to exchange. King f7. And if the knight comes back, then this knight hops in, and white is going to have to exchange some pawns here, but this certainly looks very promising for black. So e takes f5 played, and Ding exchanged pawns. Now clearly this is, you know, what he was going for, hoping that after the exchange of pawns it's going to bring white closer to a draw. But watch how Pragg dealt with this one, actually very easily. So one little tactic, if king f3, then knight takes g3, and that forces a winning king and pawn endgame. So the knight came back, and f4. Okay, very simple breakthrough actually. I mean, perhaps this surprised Ding. So exchange of pawns, king f3, king f5, and what Pragg is going to do now is put that knight on e5, which will force the king back, and then the king will either be able to come into g4 or e4, and little by little black makes progress. So let's see how he did this. You can't come in straight away, because after this king f3 takes that pawn. So first of all, Pragg just reroutes this knight. There's no hurry actually. Well, he actually came in now, but there really wasn't a defense actually. So for example, in this position, if king h3, knight e5, and black just creeps in actually, you know, little by little, it's just going to be a win actually. Knight c4 played, king here, and taking the second pawn really is game over. So let's just see the concluding moves, and it doesn't take too much skill to just creep forward, and that was the final move of the game. Ding resigned. Okay, let's just see a couple of possible scenarios. If check here and the pawn just creeps through, or okay, let's finish with a checkmate. Knight d1 and h2, and that position is Zugzwang. Knight e3, knight f2 mate. Wow, what an impressive performance by Praggnanandhaa. But somehow this was too smooth. I've seen exactly this strategy played in hundreds of games in the Sicilian. I mean, this happened to come from a Spanish, but it's exactly the same kind of pawn structure. So you play b4, you play the minority attack, and this is already very unpleasant. Let me give you just a couple of examples. So this was a game that Shirov played in the from the Kalashnikov. You can see this very familiar pawn structure with a backward d pawn, and Shirov with a minority attack against these two. And there's just serious pressure here. And after c4, well, white made a break for it. This is a game Tomczak against Shirov, and this endgame was reached. Oh, that looks familiar. Very, very similar pawn structure, and Shirov played this one really nicely and managed to force a win. That was a great move. g5, and he could target that pawn on h2. Or one more game, and this is a classic. So that was from a Kalashnikov. This one is from a Najdorf, a classic. Averbach against Petrosian from the Soviet Championship in 1959. Again, we see this very familiar pawn structure with a backward d pawn. So, and we see the minority attack 2 against 3 here. And Petrosian simply played b4 to break up those pawns. Game went like this. If pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn. Now, does that structure look familiar? Yes, it does. In this case, it's not just the b2 pawn that's weak, but it's e4 as well. So in the game, Averbach tried a4, but in fact, well, but both these pawns are weak now, actually. And yes, you can see there's a problem here because you can't even play b3. That beautiful bishop on e6 is so powerful. And the game went like this. Okay, you've got to defend that one. But, I mean, white is cracking here because this one is well protected and this one is dropping. And there's also this idea to enter with rook c2 as well, and the game went like this. Didn't win a pawn, but actually this rook is horribly offside. Oops. And, well, you can see this is fantastic. It didn't take long for Petrosian to win this one. I'm going to go right to the end because Petrosian was really in his element here. Black is so well coordinated in this position. And that is how the game ended. You see White's queen is in some trouble in that position. So yeah, what puzzles me a little bit in our game here, Ding against Praggnanandhaa, is that somehow this was too smooth. You know, we saw Ding playing a sublime game against Gukesh the other day. Today, he seemed to lack that bit of grit to fight back. And once you get to this kind of position where you know you're worse, it's really only 2 results possible. It is really hard work. So who knows what's going on with Ding at the moment. A tough one. Anyway, the standings. It was a good day for Anish Giri. There were some very nice technical performances. He outplayed Gukesh beautifully. So Anish Giri leads with 3.5 out of 4, and he's looking really good. Firuzja 3 out of 4. And then there's a trading pack. But yeah, some very, very good technical games today. Wei Yi also won beautifully against Marsudlu. Wednesday is a rest day at the Tata Steel Masters, but we'll be back on Thursday for more action. Thanks for watching.